Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this public event on Catalan women writing class 1918 to 1971. Let me say straight away, just in case you're here under false pretenses, it's not a class for Catalan women writers. We're talking about Catalan women writing class 1918 to 1971. My name is Duncan, and I'm the academic director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. This event is one of 4 public sessions, which are part of an advanced workshop on Catalan English translation being co-hosted by BCLT and the National Centre for Writing and sponsored by the Institut Ramon Llull. The Institut Ramon Llull's mission is to promote all artistic expressions of Catalan culture internationally, and this includes internationalizing Catalan literature, increasing the number of Catalan literary translations into other languages. To achieve this goal, it's necessary, among other things, to support the continuous training of translators, which is what this advanced translation workshop aims to achieve. This workshop is part of the Catalan Culture Spotlight at the London Book Fair 2022, which aims to promote Catalan literary translations into English, mainly through a professional program, a set of meetings between Catalan publishers and agencies and UK and US publishers, and a cultural program, which is where our event comes in, events both at the book fair and in different London venues. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Peter Bush. Now, for half of our audience, Peter really needs no introduction because Peter has been co-leading the Advanced Catalan English Translation Workshop, which began yesterday and is running across the 3 days. But we are joined this evening by a public audience. I expect Peter barely needs introducing to our new audience members either, but here goes. Peter Bush's first literary translation was Juan Goytisolo's Forbidden Territory, and he's translated 11 other books by this writer, including the Marx Family Saga and Exile from Almost Everywhere. He's translated a number of classics from Spanish, Fernando de Rojas' Celestina and Pedro Aracon's The Three-Cornered Hat, from Catalan, Mercè Rodoreda's In Diamond Square, Joan Salas's Uncertain Glory, and Josep Pla's The Grey Notebook. The latter two we launched at BCLT in 2014. From the French, Peter's translated Balzac's The Lily in the Valley, and he's now working on Proust's The Guermantes Way. Peter, of course, is a predecessor of mine. He's a former director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, and it's lovely to have Peter back with us, even if virtually for these few days. We have 1 hour in total this evening, and what we're planning to do is have a discussion and readings by Peter, then questions from you, our audience. We're using the Zoom webinar format, so we have a Q&A function, and please do use it. You have the option to see other people's questions as well and to upvote them so that we can make sure that we cover questions which you're finding most interesting. So do please use the Q&A function, and you're welcome to use it all the way through this session, not just at the end. We have the chat function as well, and so there are plenty of ways to respond and to suggest questions. The planning for this session actually goes back to April of this year, when I had an email from an alumna of our MA Literary Translation program, Alice Banks. And Alice got in touch about the forthcoming publication of Peter's forthcoming translation of Rosa Maria Arquimbau's 40 Lost Years. Alice is now working for Fum de Stampa Press, who are publishing Peter's new Arquimbau translation. Fum de Stampa is an independent publisher of Catalan literature in translation. So Peter's book duly appeared in July, and we've been planning over the last months then a launch event to coincide with our Advanced Catalan English Translation Workshop this month. In these discussions then with Peter, we've come up with a more wide-ranging event which addresses 3 of Peter's translations. So not just the Arquimbau, but a film, 3,000 meters, by Víctor Català. That's another forthcoming translation, which will be out, I think, in January. In Diamond Square by Mercè Rodoreda, which came out from Virago in 2013. And then 40 Lost Years by Arquimbau. So these are 3 leading Catalan novelists, all of them women. Víctor Català was the pen name of Caterina Albert, who made the role of class in Barcelona a central theme in major novels. And so that's going to be a theme which ties our 3 novels together, ties our discussion together this evening. The title of our session takes us from 1918 to 1971. That's the point when Víctor Català began writing a film, 3,000 meters. That dates from 1918 to 1921. Then In Diamond Square by Rodoreda, first published 1962. And then 40 Lost Years, first published 50 years ago this year, 1971. And so our discussion is going to take us through most of the 20th century, and we'll be touching on, I hope, a very wide range of themes in the time available, and in particular, themes relating to class and to the broader political landscape, which is represented and refracted through these 3 great novels. We'll be thinking about these novels as novels as well, not just for their thematic content, but for their writing, for the language, and for the kinds of problems which they have presented to Peter as their translator. Peter, welcome. After that introduction then from me, I'm going to really hand over to you for most of what follows. And I know you have some extracts from these 3 novels, which you're going to be reading in your translations as well. But I wonder if I could begin by asking you about the backdrop for these novels, at least significant portions of these novels, namely Barcelona. And of course, it's not a coincidence that we have 3 novels which feature working class characters and are to a large extent based in Barcelona, because Barcelona has been such a center historically for working class politics. And I wonder if you could say more about that, just by way of introducing us to the general theme.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction, Duncan, and for inviting me to come back to the BCLT. Yes, I think from the late 18th century, Barcelona began to be industrialized, and in the textile industry, to the point that it became known as the Manchester of Spain. And there was a large influx of migrants from the south in the middle, beginning to the middle of the 19th century, to work in these factories, not just in Barcelona, but in other parts of Catalonia. And in the 1860s, in the late 1860s, there was an agent, Bakunin, the anarchist, sent an agent of his called Fanelli, an Italian, to Spain to propagate anarchist ideas. And he went to Andalusia, and he came to Barcelona, and he had a fair amount of impact on on trade unionists, on workers in Barcelona and Alcoy, further north on the coast. And basically, when there was the first international, which was set up by Marx and Engels, there was a split, and the Barcelona trade unionists, Catalans, came out for anarchism on the whole, and the trade unionists, the print workers in Madrid, came out for Marx, and really that kind of mirrored the development. Well, it was the beginning of the development of a split, if you like, in the Spanish kind of organization of the Spanish working class, that has been very important up to the Civil War and afterwards. So really, to come to Víctor Català's novel, a film, 3,000 meters. She wrote this novel between 1918 and 1921. It was published in serial form in a literary magazine called Catalana. And she hadn't really published very much in the previous 12 years. She'd become known for short stories set in the countryside, and a novel also set in the countryside called Solitude, which is also a Catalan classic. And when this book was serialized, her readers were kind of shocked by the fact that she'd written a novel that centered in Barcelona. Not only that it's centered in Barcelona, but it's really centered on factories and the kind of conflict between the wealthy and the poor in Barcelona. And you have to think that in 1918 there was a kind of revolutionary kind of insurrection in Barcelona, partly prompted by the conditions in Barcelona and previous struggles in previous years, like the tragic week in 1910, but also the Russian Revolution. It was the kind of impact of the Russian Revolution, and Víctor Català was there, living in Barcelona. I should say that she came from a fishing port, La Scala, on the Costa Brava, where she was born into a family of small landowners. She didn't go to university. She was an autodidact, and she didn't belong to the elite, the literary elite of Barcelona, although she had contact with leading writers like the novelist Narcís Oller and the poet Maragall. She was not part of that elite, and she in Barcelona she had dealings with writers who were more kind of radical and more related to the kind of political struggles that were going on, that involved the anarchists. And I should say that there were kind of like two branches to anarchism in a way. There's the direct action, the kind of terrorist act anarchists, and those who believed in a kind of revolutionary change of society through a general strike, for instance. So there was kind of various trends within the anarchist movement in Barcelona.
But her own political background was not to that extent of the left, was it?
Well, her family were Republican Federalists. So they weren't. They weren't on the kind of anarchist left, but they were Republican Federalists, which meant that they were kind of opposed to kind of Madrid centralism, and Catalan was the language that they spoke. Most people on the Costa Brava, in the fishing villages and in the towns would use Catalan as their first language, whereas in Barcelona it was a more mixed picture. To me, I mean, the other thing to say about the novel is that when it came out in this serial form, and then it was published as a book in 1926, which was during the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. And the book was, pretty generally panned by the critics, mainly male critics, I should say. And as I said, they really couldn't. They said she shouldn't be writing about this kind of thing. She should go, write about the things that she know in the countryside. And it's only really until a new edition was published in 2015 by Club Editor that this novel has come back into prominence, really. So it's been a long time coming into really the mainstream in Catalan, and obviously into English translation. And even a lot of people now say to me, "Why are you translating this novel? It's not really a very good novel." But I beg to disagree. I think it's a pivotal novel in Catalan literature, and it's a novel in which the protagonist is, in fact, a man called Nonat, and he is named after Nonatus. Many of you may not have heard of him, but if you there's a BBC program called what is it, about the midwives?
Called The Midwife, yes.
Well, Nonatus House is the name of the place in the East End where those sisters are based, and Nonatus was a Catalan saint from the early 13th century, who was born with a cesarean, and well, there are various kind of stories about him, but he kind of was imprisoned in North Africa so the myth goes, in the prison they were so fed up with him pontificating that they inserted a padlock into his lips, so it shut him up. Anyway, the protagonist is called Ramon Nonat Ventura, and he is in an orphanage. He doesn't know who his parents are, and the orphanage is in Girona. He kind of grows up in this orphanage and is taken out of it by somebody who has a small factory in Girona. And the man that takes him out of the orphanage trains him. I mean, he gives him an apprenticeship, basically, so he becomes an engineering worker. And I'm going to read you the first extract, which is when he's leaving Girona, because basically he feels that his parents have rejected him. They put him in an orphanage, but he's sure that they must have had wealth, and he wants to get some of that wealth. And he realizes that he's not going to go any further in Girona with his life, and he's not going to find out what his roots are. Anyway, this is what he says when he, and I should also say that obviously in the writing of this novel, it's not, although it has this kind of social content, political content, it's not a social realist novel. You can tell that, I mean, the title, for instance, Un film 3,000 metros, she's playing with film techniques in this novel, and also serial fiction techniques from the 19th century, which in itself was, I mean, with the content and with the literary techniques, it was a challenge to the literary elite, Catalan literary elite, who preferred what's called noucentisme, a Catalan, a content and a language that was looking back to the kind of medieval Catalan and the heyday of the Catalan Empire. And so she was firmly, with this novel, putting herself against that trend within the Catalan tradition. All of a sudden, the sky cleared over Nonat. Girona oppressed him. He hated the place. From the moment he sensed he was going nowhere, he'd broken all emotional ties to the city. He reckoned that the city and its inhabitants owed him something. They'd made him victim of a swindle, of an immoral con. All things considered, he was being held there against the law and his rights, like in the orphanage, and he wanted out, though he couldn't decide how and when. He started hatching 1,000 plans and spawning countless escape routes that all fell short or were silly in one way or another. And though leaving was constantly on his mind, he stopped worrying, and like in the orphanage, he trusted that his freedom would come by chance. An obscure instinct, the instinct of the born adventurer, told him chance was the great provider, that where human guile and foresight failed, chance would resolve his dilemmas. It had opened the doors of the home for bastards, and now it would bring the walls of Girona crashing down, lead him to his parents and put him on the road to fame and fortune. When? When God willed. His goal could remain more or less distant, though not by much, the mysterious voice whispered deep inside him, but he would get his way and find the source of his fate. Of that there was no doubt, however much they hid it from him, whatever hurdles they placed in his way. And in a sense, it's a picaresque novel, because he's kind of making his way in life from the orphanage to something greater. So I'm
reminded of King Lear, of God stand up for bastards. It's an interesting take on the theme, though, because he's a working class character who is rather unsympathetic in lots of ways.
Unsympathetic to who? To the reader, you mean?
To the reader, presumably. To
the reader. Well, he's a complex character, because he's unsympathetic. I mean, he turns into a ruthless criminal, but he has a side to him which he's a very good organizer. He goes to Barcelona with a friend who finds him somewhere to live and a job in a factory, and he kind of rises in the factory by organizing it and extending the work of the factory by outreach work, which he organizes, and he becomes like the foreman of the factory, directly talking to the boss, although he's only paid a basic factory worker's wage. And he always has a very good relationship with his workmates. And Peroi, the one that he goes with to Barcelona, was one who read anarchist and radical newspapers. And Nonat talks about being emancipated. He kind of uses the language of anarchism, although what he wants is not a free society for everybody. He wants a free road up the ladder in life for himself. And in the course of he works at this factory in Barcelona, and but whilst he's organizing all this outwork in different districts, he's actually going into these and sometimes thieving in people's houses, where he's going to look at work, kind of antiques that need restoring and so on and so forth. And that comes to a head when the boss of the factory finds out. So he has to leave there. And he buys a small factory that he then outside of the center of Barcelona, which he then develops as the center for his for his criminal work, where he can handle the goods that his gang are bringing in. So he becomes a gang leader in the city, all of the time hunting for his family, his parents. So, and this gives us a kind of through this a whole kind of perspective on Barcelona society. And I'd just like to read another extract, which is of seamstresses. He has a friend, a mate called Grisau, who runs a little silversmith shop. And Grisau is somebody who's goes back to the French Revolution. His great grandfather escaped from the revolution. Most of the family were beheaded, and this great grandfather is he's a no-gooder. He's a lecturer, a lecherous jeweler, and he's got an eye on a young girl who kind of passes by his shop, and the seamstresses accompanied Nadala out, joking and asking where her fiancé was waiting for her. Nadala said nothing, tears in her eyes, distraught. They walked past the kiosk. Senor Grisau was on the doorstep in his thick woolen shoes and drooping yellow jacket, its corners hanging down to his knees. Behind his spectacles and through his puffy eyelids, he glowered like a pool of water on a mud flat. Girls, take a look at that little egg yolk, shouted one seamstress. And what a schnozzle! Like a chunk of spicy sausage, added a third. Not one I'd like a bite of, quipped another. The whole posse burst into laughter. Senor Grisau saw they were mocking him, and his pools of water muddied as if the stones they had thrown were stirring the mud at the bottom. Stinking sparrows, he parried. Adios, pollo, retorted one of the most shameless of them, who had felt stung. Make sure you don't lose your ducky slippers, Cinderella, muttered another. Too true. All the princesses will be fighting over them, chortled the one furthest away as she belched. So there's a comic side to the to this as well.
That's super, Peter. I wonder, we'll come back to seamstresses, won't we?
Yes.
When we're talking about the Arquimbau. But before we get to that, I wonder if we could move on to In
Cool.
Diamond Square, to the Rodoreda text, which is out already, and it's a very different kind of text. It seems to be in that it's much better known as a classic of Catalan fiction already, and indeed has appeared already in English translation under a different title.
Yes, there are three translations. One by Ida O'Sheil, one by David Rosenthal, American, and the one by me. So yes, the three translations. Of course, Rodoreda is the most translated, I think, Catalan author. Open Letter have translated kind of the majority of her work. So she's kind of very established and out there. And Virago approached me and asked me whether I'd like to translate Diamond Square. And basically, it is very different, but it's written by somebody who went into exile. It's the next generation of women writers. Mercè Rodoreda was a Catalan, a militant for the Catalan language, and worked in the 1930s promoting the Catalan language. She was a journalist, a feminist, and she had to go into exile when Franco's kind of entered Barcelona or before, and she was exiled in France and in Switzerland, and then didn't return to Barcelona until much later. And the heroine, Curumeta, or Pidgey in my translation, is somebody who works she's as a young girl, she works in a confectionery in Gracia, a district in Barcelona, and she marries a guy called Quimet, or Joe in my translation, who is involved in a kind of revolutionary group and goes off to fight on the front in Aragon and is killed. And Pidgey is left with 2 children. And before that, she had a really terrible time because of, her husband was getting more and more involved in kind of politics and also his work. He's a furniture maker, and his furniture making was going down the pan because, of course, the Spanish economy was going down the pan. People didn't have money to buy new furniture, and he wanted to kind of have a source of income by breeding pigeons. So he brought all of these pigeons into their flat, and the pigeons occupied kind of one room, and basically she was left to look after the pigeons, and which she liked to begin with, but then they become a tremendous burden. So yes, it's and when he goes off and people are starving, finding it difficult to find food in Barcelona, she has 2 children. The novel becomes it's really a novel about women, the women who at the home front, if you like. The men go off to war and the women are left with the children to survive. And she really struggles. But the thing about her is that she has a very kind of sensuous consciousness. So that, for instance, she cleans for a bourgeois family, and she gives these kind of very delicate descriptions of the furniture that she's cleaning and so on. She has this very imaginative, sensuous consciousness, and she recreates the things that she sees and the things that she does, and the streets that she walks down. So in that sense, she is a working class woman at the home front, who is learning bitterly through experience. And she, in one of the son she sends the son off to an orphanage outside of Barcelona because she just can't. And I'll just read a passage from yeah. And while I was waging my big revolution against the pigeons, because she starts killing the pigeons, what was brewing came, that they said would be a 2-day wonder. The gas went. I mean, it didn't reach the flat or the underground rooms in the house I cleaned. The first day we had to cook lunch on the balcony in a grey earthenware pot, hung on a black iron frame with home oak charcoal I had to fetch, and me on my last legs. That's the last there is, said the charcoal woman, because her husband had taken to the streets. Joe was also running around on the streets, and every day I'd think that would be the last I'd see of him. He put on a blue boiler suit, and after several days of smoke and churches in flames, he walked in with a revolver in his belt and a double-barreled shotgun over his shoulder. And it was so hot, so blistering hot, the clothes stuck to your back and the material stuck to your whole body, and people were very scared. The grocer's downstairs was soon cleaned out, and no one could talk about anything else. And one lady said you could see it coming a long time ago, and people always took up arms in the summer, which is when the blood comes to the boil the quickest. And even Africa, where it's always hottest, must have melted down this time. So it's a very anti-romantic view of the Civil War, and I think that what's common to the 3 women writers and the 3 novels is that there are anti-romantic views of Barcelona, from a woman's perspective.
I love the your translation of the dialogue. I mean, in both of the novels and the extracts that you've read so far. I wonder if you could say perhaps more about the language, focusing perhaps on In Diamond Square now, and particularly the dialogue, and whether with the there are particular issues that the dialogue presents to you as translator.
Well, I think the dialogue. I mean, I think all the aspects of translation that are difficult, and that I think that the kind of solutions come through your kind of drafting process and rewriting, and you get to kind of, obviously you have to create the characters, and the characters are created partly through dialogue, and as you're going from draft to draft, you're kind of individualizing the different characters' way of speaking, and you're identifying what's there in the Catalan more and more, and kind of hopefully kind of recreating it in English. But obviously, yeah, I mean, there's a whole kind of range of dialogues that you have to become. I think translators become, as you translate more and more, you become, you kind of broaden out your repertoire of language and your repertoire of dialogue writing.
And so some of the dialogue in the Catalan is Castilian Spanish as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I left some of the Spanish as Spanish in one or two of the dialogues because I thought it was perfectly kind of visible what was kind of what they meant from the context. And well, Víctor Català is one of these Catalan writers who she wanted to reflect the fact that Barcelona is a bilingual city, and that the workers are speaking Catalan, but it's kind of flecked with kind of transfers from Castilian. But also another interesting aspect of the Catalan novel is that Nonat, the protagonist, is a Catalan speaker, and he speaks Spanish, but he feels inferior when he's speaking Spanish, because he feels that he doesn't have the grasp of Spanish to masquerade as an upper class member of Barcelona society, whereas in Catalan he feels that he's there and he can handle it. But with
so the Catalan language, is then very much part of the working class identity.
Well, in that with Nonat, yes, and with that's a very interesting aspect of the characterization of Nonat. But we probably want to go on to Arquimbau, I think.
Indeed, yes.
Arquimbau, Rosa Maria Arquimbau, as with Rodoreda, was a militant journalist in the 1930s. She campaigned for the female vote. She campaigned, for abortion, right to abortion. She was very anti-clerical, and she was very, very outspoken in her journalism. And she had to go into exile, like Rodoreda, in 1939. She went to France, then she went to North Africa. She wanted to go to Latin America, but she the group of people she was failed to get on the boat, so she went back to France, to Perpignan. And really, the novel was published in 1971, as you said, and it's like Rodoreda. It's a woman looking back on her life from the early 30s through to the late 50s, and the whole kind of experience of dictatorship and exile, and the development, if you like, the kind of crushing of relationships that civil war brings, the destruction of relationships, and that destruction that carries on kind of after the war has finished. So Laura Vidal, who's the protagonist of the novel, what struck me by this novel when I first read it, and I should say that, Arquimbau is a completely, she was a completely kind of forgotten novelist. Víctor Català, she was well known because of Solitude, but everybody had forgotten Arquimbau. And it wasn't until Juliette Guillamon, a journalist and literary researcher, he kind of wrote a book about her, and about kind of 12, 15 years ago. And Coma Negra, a small, very good publishing house in Barcelona, started bringing out her works. And a feminist friend of mine, Maria Ángel Cabré in Barcelona, I was talking to her and asking her what should I translate, and she said, you really ought to look at the Arquimbau novels writing. And I got hold of the novel, and I was astonished. The voice of Laura Vidal is most striking. She is a young working class girl who is a seamstress, and she becomes her father is an anarchist. And she is involved in the demonstrations around when the Republic comes, and then she doesn't marry. She's very independent sexually, very forthright, and she also wants to kind of create a career for herself as a dressmaker. So I'll just read a small extract from them, because otherwise we're going to have no time for questions.
I wonder, just before you do that, I wonder if I could just share my screen.
Yeah, sure.
Because I've got just a slide of simply the three covers of your translations. And perhaps I could put this up now just as a sort of backdrop to your next reading. I understand that the Català cover is not the final version because there is a missing accent, but that aside, these are the three covers.
Yeah, sure. I felt the days and months pass so slowly. I wanted to grow up once and for all and be a woman and be able to do whatever I wanted, and not to have to ask permission to do everything, to be free, not to have to depend on mother or father or even on my brother and sister. That didn't mean I didn't love them, quite the reverse. I loved them a lot and would have done anything for them, even if it meant making sacrifices. I'd have liked to improve their lives and given them a decent flat to live in, and not that filthy cubby hole where we breathed the fumes from the neighbours' gas meters all the time, that were right next to our kitchen diner and very close to our bedrooms. And I'd like my father to have his own workshop, and for my brother to learn his trade in a prestigious place where they taught him properly, and not where he was working, which was out and out exploitation and taught him nothing. And for mother not to have to scrub stairs and mess up her hands, and Esperanza to own her own corsetry shop. And what about me? Well, I'd have liked to earn money from my own seamstress shop so I could help everyone in the family. But I wanted to be free, not to depend on them, not to have to ask their permission for everything, or for them always to be giving me orders, scolding me and forcing me to do things I didn't like. But being 14 meant just that, obeying, always obeying, even though you felt a rebellious spirit inside you. A rebellious spirit you'd no choice but to stifle, because let's face it, whatever could you have done? Time had to go by, clearly, and time took its time. It really did, too much so. I'd have liked it to pass much more rapidly, to go to sleep one night and wake up the next morning with my dreams all fulfilled. Well.
Great writing, great translating, Peter. Really wonderful. Yes. But sorry, do carry on.
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, all of those dreams are dashed, and she comes back and does manage to establish a business as a dressmaker, but she's solitary, and she has friends who went into exile with her, but she doesn't have children, and so she ends up having achieved part of what she wanted to do in life, but being very bitter feeling isolated and lonely, without children, without really kind of any relatives that are left. And in that sense, she's different to Pidgey in Diamond Square, because she marries, she remarries, she marries a grocer, and it seems that she has some kind of reconciliation and some kind of closure to the Civil War experience. But Arquimbau's Laura Vidal has none of that. She's kind of left feeling empty and bitter. And I think
it's a more, I mean, hence the title of the book and the very last words of the narrative, 40 Lost Years.
That's right. And I think in a way, Rosa Maria Arquimbau, for me, it's like a novel that she wrote as an answer to In Diamond Square. I don't know if that's true, but it seems it's like a parallel novel, but it gives a very different view of a woman's experience, from the same high hopes, but to then real bitterness and a feeling of emptiness at the end of a void in life.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
so we get a strong sense then of private lives being ruined by the political developments.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly a civil war is very different to a national war between nations. I think that we forget that with the Civil War, people, the defeated, had to live in the same towns and the same streets as the people who defeated them, and to be guarded, in the sense that, like, the Catalonia was almost like under occupation with the civil guard and the army, with the language being suppressed. And that went on, and there were degrees and there were comings and goings, but it carried on to a large extent until 1975, when the dictator died. Whereas in England, in the UK, people came back from fighting the war to build a new society and the welfare state, and then the swinging 60s and all of that. Well, when there were the swinging 60s in the UK, the fascist police was still beating people up and torturing them in Madrid and Barcelona.
We are well advanced, but we have time for audience questions. So can I invite our audience to ask your questions, please, whether in the Q&A or the chat. We have time to open up to any questions that you might have that have been prompted by the discussion or by Peter's readings this evening. Let me just, talking of the chat, pop the link through. That's to the Arquimbau on the Fum d'Estampa website, so this is this came out in July, and as we've mentioned, then the In Diamond Square came out back in 2013, and a film, 3,000 meters, will be coming out in just the other side of Christmas. Peter, you indicated that the Víctor Català was a kind of foundational text, and it was important for what follows and for the influence that it had on these later writers. So, are there? I mean, there are these novels are to that extent interrelated.
I think so, because Víctor Català's work, you have that sense of the women's perspective of a novelist who was her own woman, as it were, who had her own ideas about art and what she wanted to do in her writing. And for instance, she had very extensive correspondence with male writers in Barcelona like Narciso Uller and Margall, but they would say to her, well, you ought to do this and you ought to do that, and she said, well, thank you for your advice, but no. She kind of knew what she wanted to do, and I think that certainly Rodoreda was in that mold, and I think Arquimbau as well.
And can I ask you then? Are your choice of these novels then to translate? Is that, I mean, are you consciously looking for strong voices from working class novelists or from women novelists, or how? I mean, is there are there more plans for further working class novels by women writers on your translation agenda for the coming years? I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your own approach to how to this subject matter and to this writing.
Well, I think I've always been attracted by writing that is opposed to the establishment and that wants radical change, which may go kind of hand in hand with a radical approach to style. I mean, as you said, I mean, I started translating Juan Goytisolo, and he went into exile in 1956, and he never went back to live in Spain, although he was a kind of tremendous presence in the Spanish literary scene and through his journalistic work in El País after the death of Franco. And then I translated Juan Carlos Onetti, Uruguay, very great Uruguayan writer. He also was in exile. He had to flee the dictatorship. Leonardo Padura, who's a very critical Cuban writer who still lives in Cuba. So, I mean, actually, some of these, I mean, that's the kind of work I like to translate. Sometimes I kind of find the work, and sometimes it comes to me, like Virago. Out of the blue, I got an email from an editor at Virago saying, would you like to translate in Diamond Square, La Plaza del Diamant by Rodoreda? Well, of course I would. And similarly with Open Letter, Kaya Straumanis, she wrote me this, would you be interested in translating Víctor Català's film 3,000 meters? And I said, of course, I'm delighted to translate such a novel.
And are you translating differently when you're retranslating then? I mean, when you're aware of earlier translations?
I tend not to look at the previous translations until my translation is almost at kind of is at final draft stage, and then I'll look at previous translations to see what how the previous translations went about it. Also, it's useful because the previous interpretations by translators may alert you to things that you've missed. It may alert you to mistakes that you've made in your translation as well. But sometimes when I translated the Celestina, my translation was consciously against the previous tradition of translating Celestina, because I wanted to create something that was more of a novel and less of a failed play, which is how a lot of the translations approach it.
A question from Charlotte Byrne. Besides perhaps references to geographical locations, character names and certain hints in dialogue, how might you maintain the Catalanness of a text when you're translating for an English-speaking audience? Do you think there is one? So a question about loss and compensation. Do you think there is such a thing, such a tone?
It's a very good question. I mean, well, for instance, I mentioned that with Diamond Square, I decided to give some of the characters English names, because I thought that they were kind of hugely symbolic, and that would be kind of lost. And I wanted that symbolism to come through. Like Kulumeta, the protagonist, I translate as Pidgey, which is what Kulumeta is. Kulumeta to an English reader means nothing. On the other hand, with the Víctor Català novel, I decided not to do that, and I put a kind of glossary of dramatis personae, if you like, at the beginning, explaining what the symbolic kind of content of those of the names is. Well, yes, I mean, I try to hold on to the, always maintain the Catalan street names, place names, and things like that. For small things like peseta in Catalan is spelt with 2 S's. I always, in my translations from Catalan, preserve that. And like Las Ramblas, in Spanish, it's Las, L-A-S, R-A-M-B-L-A-S. In Catalan, it's L-E-S, R-A-M-B-L-E-S. I kind of maintain those Catalan spellings throughout. So there are kind of small things like that that one can do as a translator. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a difficult one, because it's like, when you translate Cuban Spanish or Argentine Spanish, how do you mark the fact that what you're translating is Argentine Spanish and Cuban Spanish and not Peninsular Spanish? It's a tricky one, that, and there's not an easy solution to
that. A question from James Chow Thomas, which opens up, I think, to a broader issue. James asks, translating dialogue from very old texts, say the 16th century, often requires an inventive modern register in the target language so as not to sound like pastiche or alienate readers.
Absolutely.
However, more recent prose texts, say from 1920, can work with a register in the target text from the same era as the action of the source text. Do you think there's a cutoff chronologically in source texts when translations need to use a completely modern register?
I think that what do we mean by modern register? I mean, I think a lot is to do with the kind of, like the Catalan novel is from the 1920s. Obviously I don't use any language, any kind of lexis that would not belong in 1920s English. Whereas if I was translating something the other day which was about drugs and there's all the kind of drug slang in it, and obviously you need to kind of, that has to be there in the slang that is used today. I mean, I'm all I can say is I'm very, when I translated the Celestina, one of the things that I was set on not doing is creating a pastiche. Because there are plenty of Celestinas that are this kind of pseudo Elizabethan English, and basically James Mabb, when he translated Celestina in beginning of the 17th century, he did that. He did a wonderful translation, and we don't need any kind of pale versions of that, because he's already done it. It needs something else to bring Fernando de Rojas to life for a modern reader.
We are basically out of time. It's approaching 8 o'clock. So perhaps I can just draw our audience's attention to a further public event which we have tomorrow afternoon, where the focus is on Catalan poetry in English. That's at 3 p.m. UK time tomorrow afternoon. And if you would like to book for that, then please have a look at the BCLT website, bclt.org.uk, and there's a link through to the Eventbrite booking page for Catalan poetry in English, 3 p.m. tomorrow. The Advanced Catalan English Translation Workshop continues and indeed concludes tomorrow. So Peter, you've got another full day tomorrow. We need to let you go. Thank you to everyone for your questions, but above all, thank you so much, Peter, for introducing us to the fascinating treatments of this set of themes in these novels. Thank you for your readings and for introducing us to your splendid translations. And we can look forward then to the Catalan translation, and we can already enjoy your Arquimbau translation and the Rodoreda. So with that, I should say this event has been recorded and it will be available on the BCLT YouTube channel shortly. But for the moment, Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you very much
for your readings and for your introductions and explanations this evening. I wish everyone a very pleasant rest of evening. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.